Black artist sculpts in public onlookers amazed by hidden message. The first handful of onlookers barely noticed Marcus Johnson as he unloaded his tools from a weathered pickup truck at the edge of Centennial Park. His movements were methodical, practiced, a man who knew exactly what he was doing. Setting up a small workstation beneath the sprawling oak trees, he arranged his chisels in perfect order, positioned a large block of what appeared to be ordinary limestone on a portable stand, and began to work. It wasn't until his chisel made contact with the stone that heads began to turn. The rhythmic tap-tap-tap carried across the park on the autumn breeze, a heartbeat in stone that drew curious glances. Marcus paid no attention to the growing crowd, his focus absolute as his hands moved with deliberate precision, each strike of the mallet sending tiny fragments of stone cascading to the ground. "What's he making?" A woman in a business suit whispered to her companion, coffee clutched forgotten in her hand. "No idea," the man replied with a slight frown. "But he didn't get a permit. I work for the city. This isn't a designated performance area." A young mother pushing a stroller slowed her pace, then stopped altogether. Her toddler pointed with chubby fingers. "Man making," the child announced with delight. By noon, a semicircle of onlookers had formed at a respectful distance. Some stayed for a few minutes before continuing their day. Others found spots on nearby benches, oddly transfixed by the quiet intensity of the sculptor. Phones emerged to capture videos and photos, but Marcus remained immersed in his work, seemingly oblivious to the attention. What began as curiosity, however, was rapidly evolving into something else. Confusion, concern, judgment, because as the shape began to emerge from the stone, so did the whispers. "Is that a weapon? Looks like he's carving some kind of gun. Should someone call park security?" The limestone block was gradually transforming under Marcus's skilled hands, its crude initial form taking on more defined edges. And though the sculpture was far from complete, the emerging silhouette did indeed resemble something long and potentially threatening, a shape that made several onlookers exchange uneasy glances. A security guard approached, hand resting casually on his radio. "Afternoon, sir," he said, voice carefully neutral. "Mind if I ask what you're working on here?" For the first time since he began, Marcus paused. He straightened his back, rolled his shoulders, and turned to face the guard and the watching crowd. His eyes, kind but penetrating, moved slowly across the gathered faces. "What do you see?" he asked simply, gesturing to the half-formed sculpture. And in that moment, the moral question that would drive everything that followed hung in the air like the dust from the limestone. How quickly do we judge what we don't yet understand, and what price do we pay for those assumptions? Marcus Johnson had not always been a sculptor. For 23 years, he'd taught high school physics in Chicago's South Side, guiding students through the elegant equations that described our universe. His classroom had been famous, or perhaps infamous, for one particular rule: no conclusions without evidence. "Assumptions are the enemy of discovery," he'd tell each new class on their first day. "They close doors before you've had a chance to peek inside." It was a philosophy that served his students well, with an unusually high percentage going on to pursue careers in science and engineering. But it was a philosophy that hadn't saved his youngest brother, Dion, who had been reaching for his wallet when the officer mistook the motion for something more threatening. That was 4 years ago. Marcus had resigned from teaching the following semester. He'd moved to this mid-sized city with its sprawling parks and renovated downtown, seeking something he couldn't quite name. Peace, perhaps, or purpose. He found it in stone. "I've never been artistic," he'd explained to his neighbor, Alina, an 86-year-old retired librarian who had taken to inviting him for Sunday dinners. "But something about the permanence of sculpture speaks to me. Physics is about understanding the fundamental nature of things. So is this, just with my hands instead of equations." Alina had nodded sagely, passing him a basket of cornbread. "Sometimes our second acts make more sense than our first," she'd said. "My Herbert was an accountant for 40 years. After he retired, he took up baking. Said numbers and measurements soothed him either way." Marcus lived simply in a small house with a detached garage that he'd converted into a studio. His days fell into a steady rhythm. Mornings spent teaching himself the techniques of stone carving through books and online videos, afternoons practicing, evenings planning his next pieces. His first attempts had been crude, misshapen birds and abstract forms that resembled nothing in particular. But he was a natural teacher, even of himself. He learned quickly. The sculpture that would change everything began as a dream. 3 nights in a row, Marcus had awakened with the same image burned into his mind: a shape emerging from stone, revealing something hidden beneath. When he sketched it out, he knew immediately that this would be his first public work, not that he'd sought permission. Something about this piece demanded witnesses, required the tension of being seen before it was understood. He'd selected Centennial Park for its central location and diverse foot traffic. People from all walks of life passed through daily, business professionals on lunch breaks, mothers with young children, students from the nearby university, retirees feeding the ducks. The day before, he'd visited the park to select the perfect spot, open enough to be seen, but not directly in a walkway. Near enough to benches for people to sit and watch if they chose to. He timed how long it would take to complete the rough form, about 4 hours. The details would require at least that long again. What he hadn't anticipated was Catherine Chen. Catherine was 32, a journalist for the local newspaper who specialized in human interest stories. She'd been in the middle of a frustrating morning, having just learned that her pitch for a series on housing insecurity had been rejected as too depressing. "Readers want uplifting content," her editor had insisted. "Find me something that makes people feel good." She'd left the office without a clear destination, simply needing to walk off her disappointment. That's when she'd spotted the gathering crowd in the park. Journalists develop a sixth sense for the unusual, and Catherine's had been honed by a decade in the field. Something about the body language of the onlookers, the mixture of curiosity and unease, drew her forward. She arrived just as the security guard was approaching Marcus. When Marcus asked his question, "What do you see?" Catherine found herself stepping closer, notepad already in hand. This was a story unfolding in real time. She could feel it. The security guard shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, I'm just doing my job. We've had some concerns from park visitors about what you're carving there." "I understand," Marcus replied, his voice deep and measured. "But I'm curious about what you see." The guard glanced back at the sculpture, still very much a work in progress. "Honestly, looks like some kind of rifle or weapon, and given that this is a public park with children." Catherine watched Marcus's face carefully. There was no anger, no defensiveness, only a thoughtful nod. "That's a fair observation based on what's emerged so far," he said. "Would you allow me to continue? I think the finished piece might surprise you." Something in his calm confidence made the guard hesitate. He glanced around at the watching crowd, then back to Marcus. "You don't have a permit for this," he said, but his tone had softened. "I don't," Marcus acknowledged. "And if you need me to leave, I will, but I'd like to finish what I've started if possible. It'll take about 3 more hours. The guard seemed to be weighing his options. Finally, he sighed. "I'll check with my supervisor. Until then, you can continue, but if he says you need to pack up, that's it, okay." Marcus nodded his thanks and turned back to his work. The crowd, which had gone quiet during the exchange, now buzzed with renewed interest. Catherine edged closer, waiting until Marcus had made a few more careful strikes with his chisel before speaking. "Excuse me," she said. "I'm Catherine Chen from the Daily Chronicle. Would you mind telling me about your sculpture?" Marcus glanced up, assessing her with the same thoughtful gaze he'd given the guard. "It's not ready to be described yet," he said finally. "It needs to become itself first." "Fair enough," Catherine replied. "Can I ask why you chose to work here in public?" At this, a small smile touched the corners of Marcus's mouth. "Art in studios is seen only after it's finished. The journey is private, but sometimes the journey is as important as the destination. Sometimes what we think we see isn't what's really there at all." Catherine jotted this down, intrigued. "May I stay and watch, perhaps talk more when you're further along?" Marcus nodded, already refocusing on the stone. "Everyone is welcome to watch, that's the point." And so Catherine found a bench nearby, settling in for what she sensed would be much more than just another human interest story to appease her editor. As Marcus returned to his work, the crowd began to evolve. Some people left, replaced by new curious onlookers. A group of college students spread out a blanket nearby, occasionally glancing up from their textbooks to watch. An older man with an artist's portfolio sat down and began sketching the scene. But not everyone was content to simply observe. A middle-aged woman in an expensive coat approached Catherine's bench. "Are you with the city?" she asked, voice low but urgent. "No, I'm a reporter," Catherine replied. The woman frowned. "Well, someone should do something. This is inappropriate for a public space. My grandson is playing at the playground just over there." "What exactly concerns you?" Catherine asked, professional instincts kicking in. "He's carving a gun, for heaven's sake," the woman said, as if it should be obvious. "In times like these, with school shootings and violence everywhere, this kind of display is threatening." Before Catherine could respond, another voice joined in, a young man who had been listening nearby. "It doesn't look like just a gun to me," he said. "The proportions are off. I think it might be something else entirely." "Like what?" the woman challenged. The young man shrugged. "I don't know yet. That's what makes it interesting." The woman made a dismissive sound and walked away, pulling out her phone as she went. Catherine made notes, capturing the exchange verbatim. This was becoming about much more than a man carving stone. It was about perception, about the assumptions people make based on incomplete information. And as Marcus continued to work, those assumptions began to multiply and divide like cells, creating an organism of speculation that grew with each passing hour. By early afternoon, the crowd had swelled to nearly 50 people. Word had spread through social media, a black artist creating controversial public art in Centennial Park. The descriptions varied wildly. Some guy making a gorgeous sculpture, protest art about gun violence downtown. Possible situation at the park, police checking it out. This last post, though inaccurate, no police had arrived, only the single security guard who was now standing at a distance, occasionally speaking into his radio, drew even more attention. 2 local news vans had parked at the edge of the park, reporters setting up for live broadcasts. The atmosphere had shifted subtly. What had begun as casual curiosity was developing an edge, a tension that vibrated in the air like the moment before a thunderstorm. People had begun to take sides, though what those sides represented remained unclear even to them. Marcus worked on, seemingly oblivious to the growing commotion. His movements remained precise, unhurried. The sculpture was taking clearer form now, though still ambiguous enough that multiple interpretations remained possible. Catherine had spent the past hour interviewing people in the crowd, collecting a fascinating array of perspectives. He's obviously making some kind of statement about violence in America. It's an African sculpture, you can tell by the techniques he's using. I think it's just supposed to be provocative for publicity. Whatever it is, he's incredibly skilled. Look at how precisely he works. She'd tried to approach Marcus again, but he'd been in a zone of intense concentration, responding to her presence with only a small nod of acknowledgement. Respecting his focus, she'd returned to her observations. It was during this time that the incident occurred. A man in a business suit who had been watching with increasing agitation for nearly 20 minutes suddenly stepped forward. "This is ridiculous," he announced loudly. "This is clearly meant to be provocative and divisive. There are children here." Several people turned to stare at him. The man seemed emboldened by the attention. "I'm just saying what everyone's thinking," he continued. "This is inappropriate. It's a weapon, plain and simple." From her bench, Catherine noticed Marcus's rhythm falter for just a moment before resuming. Though his eyes remained on his work, she sensed he was listening intently. A woman with a toddler on her hip stepped forward. "My son has been watching for an hour, and all he sees is someone making something beautiful. Maybe the problem isn't the art, maybe it's how quickly we jump to the worst conclusions." The businessman scoffed. "You're being naive. Look at it." "I am looking," the woman replied calmly. "And I'm seeing something emerge that isn't finished yet. Maybe we should all wait before we decide what it is." Others began to join the debate, voices rising and falling like waves. Catherine recorded it all, fascinated by how a single, still unfinished sculpture could provoke such strong reactions. She noted how people clustered together based on their interpretations, how the lines being drawn had little to do with age or apparent background, and everything to do with something more fundamental, the willingness to suspend judgment. Through it all, Marcus continued to work. His chisel found hidden lines in the stone, revealing contours that had been there all along, waiting to be discovered. And slowly, as the afternoon light began to soften, something remarkable began to happen. The shape was changing. Or rather, the perception of the shape was changing. What had appeared from certain angles to resemble a weapon was transforming as Marcus worked on another side of the stone. New dimensions emerged, new possibilities. "Oh," someone said softly. "Oh, I see now." Others moved positions, circling the sculpture to view it from different angles. The conversations shifted, became questions rather than declarations. "Is that? Look at how this part connects to. I didn't notice that before." The businessman who had been so vocal earlier now stood silent, his certainty visibly crumbling as the true form began to reveal itself. Catherine watched his face, the journey from anger to confusion to the first hints of understanding, and knew that this was the real story. It was nearly 4 o'clock when Marcus finally straightened, rolling his shoulders to release the tension of hours of focused work. He stepped back, examining the sculpture from multiple angles. Then, with a small nod of satisfaction, he turned to face the crowd. Silence fell immediately. Every eye was on him. "When I began this piece," Marcus said, his voice carrying easily across the gathered onlookers, "many of you thought you knew what you were seeing. Some were concerned, some were angry, some were curious." He gestured to the sculpture, now transformed from its earlier ambiguous state. I invite you all to come closer, look from different angles. See what's really there, not just what you first assumed. The crowd moved forward hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence. They circled the sculpture, expressions changing as they viewed it from various perspectives. Because what had seemed from one angle to be the outline of a weapon was, when seen completely, something else entirely. From the front, it was clearly a hand, fingers extended not to hold something destructive, but in an offering gesture. And nested within the carved palm, revealed only when viewed from above, was a small, perfect rose, its petals unfurling from the same stone. The hand offering the flower was neither white nor black in the limestone, it was simply human. "It's beautiful," someone whispered. "I feel kind of stupid now," another voice admitted. Catherine watched as the businessman who had been so vocal approached Marcus directly. "I owe you an apology," he said stiffly. "I made assumptions. I was wrong." Marcus regarded him thoughtfully. "We all make assumptions. The question is whether we're willing to revise them when presented with new information." The man nodded, clearly uncomfortable but seemingly genuine. "Your work it makes a point, a good one." "Thank you," Marcus replied. Though the point wasn't about making anyone feel foolish, it was about the journey of perception, how what we think we see is filtered through our expectations, our fears, our past experiences. As the crowd continued to examine the sculpture from different angles, Catherine approached with her notebook. "Now that it's finished," she said, "would you be willing to tell me about it, about why you created it this way?" Marcus considered her for a long moment. "Art speaks for itself," he said finally, "but the process, that's worth discussing. Would you like to sit down?" They found a quiet spot beneath a maple tree turning brilliant red with autumn. The crowd around the sculpture had thinned somewhat, though many still remained, taking photos or simply standing in contemplation. "I call it perspectives," Marcus said in response to Catherine's first question. "It was designed specifically to be misunderstood at first." "Intentionally misleading?" Catherine asked, pen poised. Marcus shook his head. "Not misleading, revealing about the viewers, not the art." He explained how he had carefully planned the sculpture to appear threatening from certain angles, particularly during the early stages of carving. The ambiguous form was calculated to trigger assumptions, to make people believe they were seeing something dangerous. "But why?" Catherine pressed. "Why create something that would cause concern or even fear?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "4 years ago, my brother Dion was killed by a police officer who thought he was reaching for a weapon. He was actually taking out his ID. Catherine's pen stilled. "I'm so sorry." "Assumptions can be deadly," Marcus continued. "We make them in an instant, based on incomplete information, based on our biases, our fears. I wanted to create a piece that would make that process visible, how quickly we jump to conclusions, how those conclusions shape our reactions, and most importantly, how those initial perceptions can be completely transformed when we take the time to see the whole picture." So the sculpture changing from what appeared to be a weapon to a hand offering a flower is a metaphor for the transformation that's possible when we suspend judgment, Marcus finished. When we wait to see the complete truth before deciding what something or someone is. Catherine wrote furiously, capturing his words. "The public nature of the installation was part of this, wasn't it? You wanted people to witness their own assumptions." Marcus nodded. "If I'd simply displayed the finished piece in a gallery, the impact would have been entirely different. It was important for people to go through the process, to feel the discomfort of uncertainty, to experience the shift in perception." "And what about the rose in the palm?" Catherine asked. "What does that represent?" "Hope," Marcus said simply. "The possibility that lies beyond our first impressions, the beauty that exists when we truly see each other." As they talked, Catherine noticed a small group approaching, the security guard from earlier, now accompanied by a woman in a park management uniform and an older man in a suit who appeared to be a city official. "Mr. Johnson," the woman said as they reached them. "I'm Park Director Harriet Wells. This is City Councilman James Rivera." Marcus stood to greet them. "I understand I've created a bit of a situation today," he said. "I apologize for not seeking proper permits." The park director glanced at the sculpture, then back at Marcus. "Actually, that's what we wanted to discuss. Councilman Rivera was just viewing your work." The councilman stepped forward, extending his hand. "It's quite powerful, Mr. Johnson. When I received calls about a disturbing sculpture being created in the park, this isn't what I expected to find." "Art often isn't what we expect," Marcus replied, shaking the offered hand. "Indeed," the councilman agreed. "Which is why I'd like to propose something. The city has been looking to expand our public art initiative. We have a program that commissions works for our parks and public buildings. I believe your piece and perhaps future works would be a valuable addition." Marcus looked genuinely surprised. I appreciate that, but I'm not established as a public artist. I've never sought commissions. Sometimes the best art finds us rather than the other way around, the councilman said. The theme of our initiative this year is Bridging Divides. Your sculpture speaks to that more eloquently than any proposal we've received so far. The park director handed Marcus a business card. We'd like to keep perspectives here in the park properly installed with an artist's statement, and we'd like to discuss commissioning additional works if you're interested. Catherine watched the exchange with growing excitement. This was no longer just a human interest story, it was front-page material. Art, controversy, transformation, and redemption, all centered around a sculpture that had managed to hold a mirror up to society's tendency to judge too quickly. As the officials departed, promising to be in touch with formal paperwork soon, Catherine turned back to Marcus. "How does it feel?" she asked. "To have your first public piece not only accepted but celebrated?" Marcus looked over at his sculpture, now bathed in the golden light of late afternoon. People were still gathered around it, pointing out details to one another, taking photos, engaging in animated conversation. "It feels like a beginning," he said quietly. "Like maybe art can do what physics never could for me, make the invisible visible." Catherine nodded, understanding completely. "May I quote you on that?" "You may," Marcus said. Then with a small smile he added, "But perhaps you should wait until you've seen the whole story before publishing." "The story isn't over?" Catherine asked, intrigued. Marcus glanced back at the sculpture. "The best stories never really end. They just change perspective." The Daily Chronicle ran Catherine's story on the front page the following Sunday with the headline, "The Art of Perception, How One Sculptor Transformed Public Assumption into Awareness." Accompanying the article was a series of photographs showing the sculpture at various stages of completion, from its early ambiguous form to the final revelation of the hand offering a rose. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Online versions of the story were shared thousands of times across social media platforms. Comment sections filled with discussions about perception, bias, and the power of art to challenge assumptions. By Monday morning, visitors were flocking to Centennial Park to see perspectives for themselves. The city had moved quickly, installing a proper base for the sculpture and a small plaque with Marcus's name and the title of the piece. Plans for a more detailed installation with the artist's statement were underway. For Marcus, the attention was both gratifying and somewhat uncomfortable. He had never sought the spotlight, preferring to let his work speak for itself. But he understood that this moment represented an opportunity, not just for him as an artist, but for the conversation his work had sparked. When Catherine called to tell him that the story had been picked up by national news outlets, he thanked her for her thoughtful reporting. "You captured not just what happened," he told her, "but why it mattered." "I had a good subject," she replied. "And speaking of which, my editor is wondering if you'd be open to a follow-up piece. People are curious about your background, how you transitioned from physics teacher to sculptor." Marcus hesitated. He was still processing the events of the past few days, still adjusting to this new reality where his private artistic journey had suddenly become very public. "Maybe," he said finally, "but first, there's something I need to do." That something was a visit to Alina, his elderly neighbor who had supported his artistic efforts from the beginning. He brought the newspaper with him to their regular Sunday dinner, somewhat embarrassed by the attention, but knowing she would want to see it. Alina studied the article carefully, then looked up at him with bright eyes. "You've started something important," she said. "You know that, don't you?" Marcus shrugged, passing her the mashed potato. "It's just one sculpture." "It's never just one anything," Alina said firmly. "It's what it represents, the conversations it starts, the change it creates." Later that evening, as Marcus was preparing to leave, Alina pressed something into his hand, a small, worn book of poetry. "This was Herbert's," she said. "There's a poem in there that reminds me of what you're doing, page 42. At home, Marcus turned to the indicated page and found a poem titled The Revealing. One stanza in particular caught his attention. "What we first perceive is rarely whole, just fragments filtered through the lens of self. Truth emerges slowly, like a flower unfolding only when we pause to see." The words resonated deeply with what he had tried to express through his sculpture. He sat with the poem for a long time, thinking about the journey that had brought him to this point, from the classroom to the grief of losing his brother to the discovery of his voice in stone. The next morning, Marcus returned to Centennial Park. He wanted to see his sculpture in its new permanent setting, to observe how people were interacting with it without him present. He arrived early, before the park filled with visitors. The rising sun cast long shadows across the grass, illuminating perspectives with a warm, golden light. The city had done a good job with the installation, positioning the sculpture so that viewers would naturally circle it, experiencing the transformation of form from different angles. Marcus sat on a bench nearby, content to simply watch as the park slowly came to life. A jogger passed, slowing to examine the sculpture before continuing on. An elderly couple walked hand in hand around it, pointing out details to each other. A young mother explained something to her curious child, who reached out to touch the smooth stone surface with wonder. It was the child's reaction that affected Marcus most deeply, the pure, uncomplicated appreciation of something new, without preconceived notions or assumptions. Children, he reflected, were natural scientists and artists. They observed the world with open curiosity, willing to revise their understanding as new information became available. As he sat there, Marcus became aware of someone approaching his bench. He looked up to see the businessman who had been so vocal during the sculpture's creation, the one who had later apologized for his assumptions. "Mr. Johnson," the man said a bit stiffly, "I hoped I might find you here." Marcus nodded in greeting, curious about this unexpected encounter. "I wanted to speak with you again," the man continued, settling onto the bench with a respectful distance between them. "Your sculpture, it's been on my mind a lot." "In what way?" Marcus asked. The man stared at perspectives for a long moment before responding. "I'm the CEO of Westridge Financial. We manage portfolios, investments. My job is all about anticipating markets, making quick assessments." He paused, then added more quietly, "And I've realized that I apply that same approach to everything. Everyone. I make instantaneous judgments based on minimal information. It's efficient, but perhaps not always accurate," Marcus suggested gently. "No," the man agreed. "Not always accurate at all." They sat in silence for a moment, watching a group of college students approach the sculpture, circling it with expressions of discovery as they viewed it from different angles. "I've been thinking about your brother," the businessman said suddenly. "I read about him in the article, about how he died because someone made a split-second assumption." Marcus felt the familiar ache in his chest at the mention of Dion. "Yes, I can't imagine that pain," the man said, "but your sculpture, it made me feel something of what that might be like. To be judged so completely, so finally, without the chance to be fully seen." He turned to face Marcus directly. "I'm on the board of the police commission. We oversee training policies. After seeing your work, I've been wondering if there's something more we could be doing, some way to incorporate what you've demonstrated so powerfully about perception and assumption into how we train officers." Marcus was taken aback. Of all the outcomes he might have anticipated from his public sculpture, this wasn't one he had considered. "What did you have in mind?" he asked. "I don't know exactly," the man admitted. "But I'd like to explore the possibilities. Maybe there's a way to use your art, to help officers understand how quickly we form judgments and how those judgments can be wrong. Would you be willing to meet with the commission to discuss it?" The request was unexpected, almost overwhelming in its implications. Marcus looked at his sculpture, then back at the man beside him, someone who had moved from angry opposition to genuine reflection in the space of just a few days. "Yes," Marcus said finally, "I would be willing to do that." The businessman, who introduced himself properly as Thomas Westridge, handed Marcus his card. "Thank you. This could be the beginning of something important." As Thomas departed, Marcus remained on the bench, turning the business card over in his fingers, thoughts swirling. He had created perspectives as a way to process his own grief, to make visible the dangers of hasty judgment. He had hoped it might make some people reflect, might spark conversations. He had never imagined it could lead to actual structural change. A voice interrupted his thoughts. "Excuse me, are you Marcus Johnson, the artist?" He looked up to see a young black woman with a sketch pad under her arm. She appeared to be college-aged, perhaps an art student. "I am," he confirmed, her face lit up. "I'm Zoe Taylor. I'm studying fine arts at the university. Your sculpture, it's incredible. The way it transforms depending on perspective. I've never seen anything like it." "Thank you," Marcus said, genuinely touched by her enthusiasm. "I read in the article that you used to be a physics teacher," Zoe continued. "That you're self-taught as a sculptor, that gives me hope, that it's never too late to find your voice as an artist." Marcus smiled. "It's definitely never too late." Zoe hesitated, then asked, Would you ever consider mentoring someone?" "I mean, I know you must be busy with commissions now, but I'd love to learn from you, even just to observe your process sometimes." The request touched something deep in Marcus, the teacher he had been, the mentor he could still be. "I'm just beginning this journey myself," he said. "But yes, I'd be open to that. Perhaps we could learn from each other." The joy on Zoe's face was immediate and genuine. They exchanged contact information with plans to meet the following week at Marcus's studio. As Zoe departed, Marcus looked back at his sculpture one last time before heading home. In the late morning light, perspectives seemed to glow from within, the limestone warm and alive. The hand offering the rose was clearly visible from where he sat, a gesture of hope, of possibility, of connection. He thought about Thomas Westridge and the police commission, about Zoe Taylor and her artistic aspirations, about Catherine Chen and her thoughtful reporting, about all the people who had been touched in some way by a piece of stone transformed by human hands. It wasn't just about the art, he realized. It was about the ripples that spread outward from it. Conversations started, assumptions challenged, connections formed that wouldn't have existed otherwise. As he walked toward the park exit, Marcus found himself remembering something he used to tell his physics students. Every action creates a reaction. Sometimes the most powerful forces begin with the smallest movements. He had begun this journey alone, seeking a way to process his grief and make sense of a world that had taken his brother too soon. But now, he understood that the path forward wouldn't be solitary. The connections formed through his art were creating something new, a community of people willing to examine their perceptions, to look from different angles, to see beyond their first assumptions. And in that realization, Marcus found something he hadn't expected, a sense of purpose renewed, of possibility restored. The hidden message of his sculpture wasn't just in the transformed image of a weapon becoming an offering of peace. It was in the transformation that occurred within each person who took the time to truly see it, to circle it completely, to revise their initial judgments, to discover the beauty that had been there all along, waiting to be revealed. Marcus smiled as he walked through the park gates, already envisioning his next piece. There were more stories to tell, more perspectives to share. And now he knew there were people ready to see them, truly see them from all angles.